So welcome back again for this post-lunch session. I just want to say that the book that we're going to be discussing today is an extraordinary book. And I'm very happy to be in conversation with Aanchal about this. I'm not here just as a token interlocutor. I was very glad to be having this conversation. When it was suggested, I agreed with alacrity. And that's because it is a book that talks of a love story. It's set against tumultuous historical events of world wars and the partition, which is, of course, one of the great catastrophic events in South Asian history, with a lingering wound that afflicts an entire people, existing geopolitical tensions that show no signs of abating. But it's not just that. It's also a very tender love story. And it was this combination that drew me to the book and to Aanchal's writing. And I've just made a very interesting discovery before we moved in here, and I have to ask Aanchal to tell us more about that. I think we're going to start with Aanchal and then move into the book. You told me, Aanchal, that you were a metal engraver. And I want to know how a metal engraver became an oral historian and then turned up as a novelist, and where this metal engraver turned historian turned novelist intends to go next.
Well, thank you for being here after lunch, and thank you for that question. I don't think a lot of people know my actual training. It's not in history, not in literature, but in printing. I worked with the printing press for over a decade, and I think the way that I see the world first and foremost is through imagery. How did I become a historian? That's a good question. It was during my master's where I was working on my thesis that I had to choose a topic to display work about in a gallery. You do your thesis, you display the work in a gallery, you can choose whatever you want. And I happened to choose partition, and more specifically, objects that refugees had carried across the border to India or Pakistan or later Bangladesh, looking at the object as a catalyst for memory and a sort of object of remembrance, something that absorbs time and can lead to memory being passed down the generations quite physically. And I looked at these objects visually because I was a visual artist. But in doing so, I also interviewed the people that they belong to, and the stories, the voices, of course. There was so much more than just the physicality of the object. They talked about, most importantly, a time unpartitioned, a time when many different people lived together in seeming harmony, and a time that has sort of completely dissipated from present memory. And I felt that something needed to be done with these voices, and so I forayed into oral history, kind of really learning on the job, because now oral history is taught in academia in India, it's taught in Sri Lanka as well. But I think at the time, which was 2012, 2013, it was still very much questioned by academics as a viable primary source of the past. And so I ambled my way through oral history, and I stayed. I mean, I'm very much an oral historian. I still do all my projects with oral history as a primary source, but the studio has been left behind. And I was telling you earlier, because I'm not able to be in a studio, I try to carry the visual to my writing. And most of the times I'm successful because the visual gives you a sort of, you can slip into the image. And I think when I'm writing, I very much want my reader to be able to slip into the landscape of the book, whether it is fiction or non-fiction, and allow a kind of sensory intervention into the landscape. So being an artist, first and foremost, really helps with that.
But how did the oral historian become a writer of fiction?
That's also a good question. I think if you spend a really long time in one period of history, you know it really well. For me, I have done work on partition now for about 15 years, which is a very long time in a young person's life to spend in the past and just one period of history. As a result, I think you familiarize yourself with all the possible avenues of that landscape, to a point where when someone tells me that their relatives migrated from so-and-so village to so-and-so village, I will probably be able to tell them the mode of transportation they took because it's so familiar to me. It also means that you are a very good listener of stories. And somewhere along this 15-year period, you start to make up stories of your own. And you start to think, or at least I started to think, is history abundant enough for me to try and open it, place fictional characters into it, and see whether they assimilate into the historical landscape? I'm not interested in inventing worlds. I'm not very imaginative to begin with. But I am interested in the possibility that history allows us with fiction and how much we can allow it to be malleable to our needs. So I think I started to construct a story very slowly, but I need the aid of history because I did spend so many years being a historian of that time period, so I don't want to change things. I simply want to see what happens to characters when they are in it. And as I discovered, writing fiction is very hard. It's enormously hard. It's much harder than writing non-fiction, particularly the kind that I write with oral history, because your subject is in front of you, their landscape is in front of you, their history is available to you. But fiction requires a sort of, a sort of mesmerizing quality of imagination which you have to cultivate. And you have to be very devoted to cultivating it. And for 5 years, I was. It was very hard to get into the world of this novel, and equally hard to get out of it, because it consumed me. But I think I am the kind of person that allows for projects to consume me.
In fact, that's what I wanted to ask you, Aanchal. It's very clear that the partition, in other people's work, one can say this is a recurrent theme, or this is, in the case of poetry, a recurrent metaphor. But in your case, the partition no longer seems to be something that simply preoccupies you. It seems to consume you. It seems to be the primary subject, the only subject, the most central subject to your life and work, in a sense. And could you say more?
Yes, it was. I have completely stopped writing about partition now. A very hard stop, which is very difficult, but necessary for some distance to be created between you and the event, if you want some perspective still. But think about it like this. The generation that lived through partition in India and Pakistan and now Bangladesh as well, if they have vivid memories of that time, they are of the age 80 and above. It is a dwindling generation. It is a generation that has lived for a long time in silence. Much of the silence has been of their own making. And I think if you're working with a generation like that, then time is of the essence. And it puts a lot of pressure on anyone working in that space to record as much as they can, as vividly as they can, as soon as they can. So you can imagine how difficult it is for me when someone comes up and says, oh, I have a great-grandfather with this story, can you record it? And I have to say, actually, I can't anymore. This is a person you can go to, but I can't anymore. Because so many years of living with the trauma, other people's trauma of partition also impacts your mind and your writing. But I think the reason for my obsession with partition was that there was so much that we didn't know about that time. 70 years after partition, when I wrote my first book on the objects that refugees had carried, no one had studied objects. And I found that so surprising because as South Asians, we are hoarders of things. And we imbue memory into things. So why would we not think that objects carried on momentous journeys of migration would not hold stories, or could not be a way to introduce younger generations to traumatic stories? The second book I wrote looked at inherited memory of partition, another subject that hasn't been discussed as much in the case of partition as it has with, say, the Holocaust. We have a lot of stories about second-hand memory, intergenerational memory, inherited memory of Holocaust, but not so much about partition. Memory does not end with the generation that lived it. It passes down sometimes in silence, often in silence, but also sometimes in anger and resentment, very rarely in love and empathy. And I think silence is a very big cause of that. So what happens to the memory of partition 2 generations later or 3 generations later? And I think that was a different kind of undertaking because I was speaking to younger people. And I felt like a participant in that book because all 4 of my grandparents came from what became Pakistan, and none of them could go back. Meanwhile, as a scholar of partition, I have gone to Pakistan so many times that I carry the joy of going to the lands of their birth, but I also carry the guilt that they couldn't accompany me, I couldn't take them. And so I think, the world of partitions and migrations is ripe for a writer, of course. But it was more so that there were so many things left to talk about. Even now, I say that hardly anyone has looked at partition and caste. Hardly anyone has looked at queer stories of partition. Sindh requires a lot of intervention still. Kashmir is still an ongoing event. Hyderabad, Operation Polo, there's so much left to talk about. But for me, I have made a conscious decision to pause on the subject.
So for those of you who aren't aware of this, Aanchal's first work was about the memory of survivors. That's what it recounted. The second was about the memory of descendants. It archived that. And now we come to the novel. And one of the things I mentioned at the start is really what I'd like to return to, Aanchal, which is the fact that what struck me when I read this book was the fact that very often when one is reading the work of someone who is deeply trained or has immersed herself in another discipline, the emerging work often has a person wearing a somewhat self-conscious, the hat of a historian or the hat of a sociologist or what have you. In your case, I was struck by the fact that this felt like a novel written by someone who was a novelist, who wanted to tell stories.
Thank you.
And it also struck me that this was not about just the violence of partition. It is a story of love. And the love doesn't merely lie in the romance between 2 characters, in this case, a Hindu perfumer and a Muslim calligrapher. But it's not just that. It's the fact that one senses in this book, time and again, that there is a great love of the commonplace, the ordinary, the smell of things, the touch of things, the way in which it feels like there is a great, deep, physical longing for all the little things that hold a world together. That's what struck me about it and what moved me about it. And I wanted to ask you if that was something you set out to do from the start, or did it?
No, absolutely. And I'm thrilled to hear that it came across because very often, including the publisher's blurb at the back, books that have love stories are kind of romance novels, right? Novels about great romance. And I'm quite peeved by that because actually I felt like this was a sort of love story to family and to land and to occupation and vocation. But you're right, in all the things that hold a world together, the ordinary things. And the reason why I was so adamant on making it a novel of little things was because it is a novel that looks at a time that has been erased by history. You cannot return to a time unpartitioned by borders and the relationships that people cultivated with each other at that time. All you can do is hold on to the fragments of that time. So whether it is eating a particular kind of food, smelling a very distinct smell, remembering the texture of grass in your garden, or the sound of a friend, or the movement of a bicycle, all these things, I think, transport you to, at least for me, they transported me back to a time that I had not lived in, but it felt like I had lived it because of all the elderly people I had interviewed. And a lot of the novel actually comes from their testimonies as well. You mentioned the love story between Samir, who is a perfumer, and Firdaus, who is a calligrapher. And somewhere in the novel, later in her life, Firdaus tells her grandson, she says, for 10 years, Samir mixed with me. And this language is so strange for one person mixing with another. But it came from one of the interviews I recorded with of a lady in Calcutta, where she said, for a few months, my husband mixed with me, which meant he courted me. But I was not familiar with the phraseology of another human mixing with another. And it felt so old-fashioned. And it felt so poignant and physical, but also so incredibly malleable that it was a perfect dialogue for her as well. So I think, yes, it is an ode to all the things that have now largely been forgotten, a way of life that no longer exists. But I think also the language is a bit old-fashioned, because people spoke like that, they thought like that. There's another dialogue where a guy says, you know, I saw a woman's wrist today, and he was so happy about it. And I remember old people telling me that when we would go to school, we would see a girl's wrist peeking out, and it made us smile. And it's, you know, these small little things that you collect along the way. But I'm really glad it felt like a novel of the world, of the little things of the world.
Of texture, of smell, you know, there is the tactile. In fact, I would love you to read a section if you feel like. Okay. I wonder if you could read something from that olfactory section. You know, there is such a need to inhale other fragrances, to make them one's own.
Shall I read from the beginning?
Whatever you want.
Okay. So I'm reading from the first chapter. His nose woke up first. It shook Samir from his slumber, and he sat upright in bed, sniffing out the storm before it began. Sliding from underneath the mosquito net, he walked up to the window and opened its shutters. Ominous clouds had begun collecting, the moon camouflaged. Staring up at the firmament, he cupped his chin with both hands, resting his elbow on the windowsill. It would arrive shortly. He could smell it. It would materialize out of nowhere with a crack of bright light and thunder, and so he waited, for it was impossible to sleep through an imminent storm. 10 years earlier, when he had opened his mouth for the first time, a crying, breathing, living being, the bedroom window had flung open with a gust of wind had swept into the room, where it was swallowed completely by the newborn. Samir, his parents would name him. Samir meaning a gust of wind. Samir, the boy who'd swallowed the monsoon. And now, as the dark skies parted, he welcomed the rain shower that had unfailingly graced his birthday each year since his birth. Samir, eager to smell past this curtain of precipitation, held out his perceptive nose and followed its slope down his neighborhood, meandering through streets and homes. There were many ways to smell, but the way that gave him most pleasure, how he felt most physically and intimately connected to any smell, fragrant or foul, was by smelling it through his gut, through his stomach, like right inside. With his gut then, the boy pressed against the open window frame, smelling musty, moisture-soaked walls, moss and algae, dung cakes, damp wood, lemongrass, and lotus flower. Assembling this bouquet within his atlas of smells, Samir returned to bed 1 year older and many smells richer.
Was this how you conceived of the book? Did you conceive of it as a story between two people that you wanted to tell? Was it going to be about the atmospheric backstreets of Lahore? What was it going to be about when you started? How did it change? Lead us through the process.
That's a really good question. It was always going to be about a boy who had a great nose, who inherited the nose from either a father or an uncle. And I knew that father or uncle had a traumatic backstory. Somewhere during the oral history interviews of partition, I started to hear stories about the World War. And it, as a young person who had studied in India, the wars are not really taught as our wars. But of course, in World War I, India sent 1.5 million soldiers, and in the Second World War, we sent 2.5 million soldiers, let alone all the animals and actual material that we sent to the war. So this figure of these 1.5 million soldiers and 2.5 million soldiers really sat with me, and I wanted to find a way to thread this into the novel. Because, fiction is really one of the best ways to learn about historical events and remember them. Otherwise, it's not much different than reading something in a history textbook. And if you're not inclined towards nonfiction, you're not going to read those books. So I wanted to find a way to bring the South Asian contribution of the war into the novel. So I knew that this elder that Samir inherits his nose from would have something to do with the war. And then my mother told me a story about her father, and it came at a time when she thought it was a very ordinary story to tell. But for me, it felt like everything clicked. And this is the thing with family stories, that if you are a creative person, you don't know where they will meander and sort of fix themselves. So when my mother's father was working as a chemist in this pharmaceutical company called Dabur, he was making soaps and shampoos, and for that he would receive little vials of essences, papaya and aloe vera and all that stuff, and he would use it in his soaps and etc., etc. And whatever he didn't use, he would bring home. And in the summertime, when we in India have coolers, grass coolers that we turn on. I don't know if you have them here. It's basically a water system with wet grass, so that as you turn it on, a kind of turbine moves, and it's the precursor to the air conditioner, let's just say that. But it has water, standing water in it. So she said that he would put these little vials of rose essence or papaya essence into the water, and when the cooler went on, one day the house would smell of roses, the other day it would smell of aloe vera, a third day it would smell of jasmine. And this one person going out of their way to create a kind of bouquet for the entire family to live in, it felt so beautiful to me. And from there was born the character of Vivek, Samir's uncle, who would give him his ability to smell and create perfume. It was never a love story. It was always about a relationship between an uncle and a nephew. And I think for me, those are the protagonists, the key protagonists of the story. The war comes alive through Vivek's experiences. Partition comes alive through Samir's experiences. And how I think we are forced to hold on to the traumas of our ancestors as we inherit them. That's really, I think, what the novel was for me.
Yes, certainly there's love and there's family. The whole notion of kinship in one way or the other, fractured, reclaimed, all of that. And it actually brings me to this question, Aanchal, which is something you touched on, but I remember reading this interview where you said that your grandmother once told you that when she recounted her experiences to you of the partition, she said, you at the end of this can leave, whereas I don't get to leave. I end up in this loop. And that moment in that conversation stayed with me, and I want to ask you about that. What does it mean? You've dealt with memory, which is in itself, if it's a loop of its own kind, memory fictionalizes, memory edits. Memory is not fact, in the sense that people like to think of fact. Fact itself perhaps is a whole questionable area. But moving from memory to conscious storytelling, perhaps from unconscious storytelling to conscious storytelling, open that up for us. What has that meant?
It's a very good question. It's something I grapple with, and something I was unprepared for when she told me, because she said it in an almost accusatory tone, which surprised me because we had been talking about her experiences of partition for over 10 years at that point. So I began to think, have I forced her to return to that time, to return to her migration, to return to the train station, to return to the dead bodies she saw, to the camp she lived in? How many times have I asked her what your first meal was in the camp? How many times have I asked her, what did your mother feel like? And I felt almost small, because there she was telling me that had I not asked, this subject would have never come up. And I would have been bereft of this memory and these experiences like I had been my whole life. But now this is a sort of, I suppose, an ethical issue you grapple with. When you bring up a traumatic time from someone's past, are you doing more damage than good? On one hand, it is perhaps the closest you're going to get to the texture of that historical world and trauma. It's the most intense conversation, remembrance. It's so emotional and so meaningful. But then what happens psychologically to the person who remembers it? And I have to say that this is not the case for every person. Some people are quite happy actually talking about the past, and they create a distance between their present self and their past self. For other people, it's far more difficult. I mean, oral history has taught me not to generalize anything when it comes to people. But I don't know, now she's not alive. As a person who earned for her family, as someone who raised children in very difficult circumstances, as someone who was very proud of the fact that she worked in the morning and went to college at night, as someone for whom money was a very big thing because she came from nothing. And all of these things, they showed me different sides of her that I would have never known. So I still am grappling with that. I don't have a good enough answer for that, but it is something that weighs on my mind. Yeah, I think about it a lot.
I understand. And I also get what you're saying about it having brought the two of you closer. I have a story. For me, my grandparents came from Burma, and that was another whole traumatic event. But talking about it to my grandmother, seeing her as this young woman in Myanmar, I think that brought us closer in so many ways.
But I also think when you talk about it, at least for partition and Burma specifically, there is so much work left to be done on the journeys that people took from to south of India all the way to Punjab from Burma. What I noticed is that we start to build a language of that time that doesn't exist. The language of remembering that time. And that language is not only verbal language, it's as much silence, non-verbal language, and bodily language,
I agree completely. I know that there's someone who periodically holds up a board, and we are mindful of time, But before we throw this open to the audience, I want to ask you, Aanchal, listening can be as exacting, as demanding as recounting. And to hold space for the tellers of these stories can be deeply fatiguing as well. You know, there's a different kind of burnout that can happen when you become this sort of, this endless listener. There's a kind of recessivity that never ends. So how have you dealt with what all the war journalists call compassion fatigue? How do you deal with that?
Well, at first you have to know it's happening to you. I think for me, I didn't even realize it was happening to me until 5 years into this work, when I was listening to a story from this area called Mirpur, which is now in Pakistan, Kashmir in Pakistan. And the physical violence in that story was shocking. Everything from abductions to murder to someone stepping on a woman's neck and cracking it, to a woman being abducted and taken into Pakistan, the rest of her family taken to a concentration camp called Ali Beg. I mean, it was relentless. And I think it was the first time that someone, the interviewee themselves, said, "Are you not tired of listening to this?" But the way in which she was talking, it felt as though she was talking about things that were happening to another person. So she had divorced herself from those things, perhaps as a way of actually coping with them and moving on in life. When I came back home, this was in a city, it was in Chandigarh, which is 6 hours from where I live. I missed my train because I was listening to her. I came back and it was the first time that I couldn't sleep, but I began to imagine and dream about these stories. All the stories that she had told me sort of bled into each other, and I would wake up in the middle of the night and think about them. And it was then that I actually reached out to other people who recorded similar stories of trauma and said, "How do you deal with it?" My way of, at the time, extracting myself from the listening process was taking a few weeks break before I transcribed the interview. Because the transcription is a very intense process where you're just with the voice. And you spend many hours listening to the same thing again and again. And then you translate it into English from whatever language it's been told to you in. So you're actually really embroidering yourself into the voice of the person. And I needed my distance. And I think after that, I periodically took months off, weeks off. It's the only way I knew to not stop completely, but to also continue being an active listener in the process.
Thank you. Thank you. That's lovely.